Okay, so as a general initial disclaimer, this video is going to be talking in depth about a lot of the story beats in the most recent Guild Wars 2 patch, What Lies Beneath. It's not really a summary, but, spoilers. So this isn't me trying to tear the patch apart or claim that it was the worst thing ever. I actually enjoyed most of it. As a Guild Wars 2 fan and as somebody who writes a lot, there were moments which really frustrated me because they only seemed to highlight the bits which I felt were the weaker aspects of the patch as a whole. So when I think about this or that part of the overall Guild Wars 2 story and what works and what doesn't work, there are two major sort of angles that I come at it with. How it's functioning in terms of the plot and how it's functioning as part of the game. And that's true both of the moments in the story journal and in, a more abstract sense of Guild Wars 2 as this MMO and how it's evolved over time. But for this, I'm kind of focusing more on the plot. First, we had the instance in Kaineng, which you could breeze right through it and largely skip it over because most of it was optional dialogue. And I think one of the problems is a lot of people probably did because we wanted to get to the new map. Then we had two more instances bridged by a fairly straightforward open world segment, and it culminates in a post-boss fight sort of epilogue moment before leaving off on what actually turns out to be the start of the next chapter, which I'll come back to later, only because it's not there yet. It's just, watch this space. And obviously that's not the whole patch because, as always, the new map has its own meta event and a list of achievements to work through, and overall, I don't think I'm the only one who felt this chapter was, a little light. And why was that? Well, firstly, it is a fairly short amount of raw story content when compared to some of the larger patches we've had in the past. And that's both in terms of sheer focused run-through and the amount of story beats within the patch itself. But I don't think that alone is the problem, because the feeling is compounded by the structure and the pacing of the patch and the context in which it arrived. So for that context, this is the first beat of a new addition to End of Dragons. The familiar format of such story updates in the past would have had it as its own entry in the story journal, distinct from the expansion it came after as part of a new living world. So not only is that different, but we've just spent the last year being given Living World Season 1 back, which was condensed from 25 shorter episodic releases, although that's including the South Sun arc, which hasn't actually come back, down to just 5 bumper episodes. So either you are a player who has just spent the last year rolling through those and being used to a lot of story to plug through in each episode, or you skipped over it because you did it the first time, and you've had a year to just sort of sit and twiddle your thumbs. In either case, after all that, What Lies Beneath had a very high bar to me in order not to feel underwhelming, and, well, here we are. But I made that point earlier about the pacing and the structure being a factor, because I think a big reason this story felt so short is that there wasn't really anything to stop people just blasting straight through it. Throughout the Living World, ArenaNet have varied how they try to pace out story episodes, from gating with masteries to forcing heart completion to, sending people on a tour of the map and doing a little bit of heart completion by stealth. And there are pros and cons to all of these strategies, but a big emphasis has always been giving players a reason to fan out and take a look around the map before jumping into the next instance, which, it's a lot harder to do when the map is structured as a zone capture, because you can't just have a story step where players essentially complete open world events to fill a bar. After all, what if you arrive when it's halfway through? Especially when the story characters are the ones driving that meta event, and now you have this kind of awkward dissonance from them being left behind while you scout ahead 1 minute, to being already down at that final boss arena you didn't open up yet the next. So where in previous story chapters we'd realistically have a pretty similar number of instance moments, the story would feel longer due to the time we spent in the open world between the start and the finish. And this time around, that just didn't happen. I think another issue with this patch, which is also a side effect of that zone capture map, is psychological. Because, what was the last zone capture we had with outlines over each segment? Oh yeah, Drizzlewood. And that calls people's thoughts back to the frustration and missed opportunities of the Icebreed saga. Now, whether people liked or disliked that map and those patches as a whole, The fact of the Icebreed Saga is that we know it was heavily cut to make way for End of Dragons, and the general perception of it was a dramatic decrease in overall quality, and ultimately it just didn't work out. So with that in mind, it's a very unfortunate association. However good Icebreed Saga started out, we know how it ended. So at this point, with just the one example of this new format to go on, and the studio's past history of announcing new directions only to have to backtrack when they don't pan out, I think there is a legitimate reason for people to be wary and even disappointed. On some level, it's hard not to see those past patterns, even if it's realistically still far too early to make any kind of actual judgment. Still, I mentioned before that my biggest frustration was that I don't think it had to be this way, and I'm going to throw out a heap of disclaimers at this point because I'm not a game dev, I don't work for ArenaNet, and I don't know what kind of limitations they're working with, both in terms of how they deliver the story and how they design the maps which that story fits into. There are no doubts in my mind that I'm about to suggest something they were physically incapable of doing, but I don't think all of it would have been, which is why I want to include my thoughts here. So let's take it beat by beat. Okay, first, that letter. I mean, ArenaNet, why? We're coming off the back of a hugely emotive and powerful story, the culmination of a decade's work, and then we pick up after the epilogue with a weirdly awkward invitation to a vague and equally awkward party? I am getting whiplash. But, okay, what is it trying to do? As I said in the opening of this video, there are two ways to look at stories: the quality of the narrative and the purpose of that narrative structure. So in that respect, this story beat has to give us a smooth transition back to Cantha and also acknowledge the shift in central characters. That structural need sets up the narrative beat of Rama reaching out to invite people to a gathering where we will get the moment which pulls us into a group together. It serves its purpose. But as it plays out in game, it also just feels clunky. You have a whole instance to just stand around and gorge awkwardly on appetizers while waiting for a call to action. I'm going to assume that there are good reasons this happened. I have to wonder whether the year's interval is a part of that, because it makes it easier to overlook the fact that, played linearly, we've now got 3 dialogue-centric instances in a row, and 2 of them are parties. But even leaving that aside, I think it would be straightforward, on a conceptual level at least, to make this instance, more interesting. I'd actually start with the letter too, because it just seems very strange how it's written. If Rama really sent an invite to so many people that he's turned it into a mass mail because, gosh, it's just too much to manage otherwise, how on earth did none of them show up to stuff themselves silly on free food at one of the swankiest places in Kaineng? It doesn't make sense from a narrative standpoint, and from a gameplay side of things, it sets the player up to expect a wider range of familiar faces in the coming story. I think a better rework would actually be to have Gorick send the invite, perhaps as a formal launch party for the detective agency. And then it's easier to explain that, perhaps most of the people he thought to invite have more going on now that keeps them away from Cantha, and it's really just the commander who's having problems settling down again, which also helps to foreshadow the coming story. Rama can still be a little miffed that no one else showed up, as he was the one who organised the catering, and now, well, look, there's way too much. I also think that in an ideal world, it would have been better to have this instance in a less salubrious part of Kaineng. It would help explain why no one local showed up for a free meal, and it would also allow for some actual interaction in the instance, perhaps a mini event where we have to recharge the air conditioning similar to the Metal Legion AMP events, or something like that. The dialogue from Rama and Gorick could then have played over the top, which would have made it feel more interactive than just sort of trying to work out which of the nearly identical appetizers is the one you need for the achievement. The best option would actually be to have a new dedicated restaurant instance similar to the Dead End. It would even play up the parallels between the epilogue and the start of this story, as well as giving us a future base for discussing story steps in Cantha. But I do appreciate that this would probably have needed more time and work than was available. As I say, I'm aware game dev has limitations. Chiefly though, I think the main focus needed to emphasize that, issues with the name aside, the detective agency really is a joint venture. And if Rama's getting cold feet, perhaps that could be what he mentions in the instance instead of the vague feeling that Gorick has just gone on ahead and dragged the others into it without telling them. After all, the world's at peace now. Things have calmed down to just, the normal sort of crime. And is that really worth coming out of retirement for? Changes like this might sound significant, but in terms of writing, it's really not. We're talking some tweaked dialogue and some letter reworks, which, with one glaring exception, I think is really the only sort of change I would make about this chapter as a whole. It's not a bad opening, and the other instances aren't bad either. It's just, I don't feel it makes the best use of the story beat that it has. But let's move ahead to Gyalar, because I think this instance started out really well, although the busy work with the various Brotherhood miners got a little too repetitive for my taste. I think in this case it might have been better to have streamlined it into fewer people, perhaps by cutting the ones who don't even tell you anything, and having some of their individual tasks be longer or more complex. For example, I really thought the medicine kit could have been more interactive, like we saw in Path of Fire, and not just a straightforward fetch like all of the others. From there, the only issue is, again, the length. I think it would have been better to take a moment here and introduce the air filters, especially as they're such a major part of the map as a whole, and it's a little frustrating the first time you go in without one and just have to turn around again and go get them. I don't know, maybe the filters were Yao's idea, and that's part of the reason they're here. It makes more sense in terms of understanding that this is a relatively recent development too, which it would have to be, because this mine looks way more established than you could get if most of the workforce have been randomly losing their minds or frothing at the mouth from the start. But this also leads into what I think is the biggest problem with the patch, which is the meta. Honestly, this isn't something that dialogue tweaks can fix. I actually think that, although I don't hate it as a concept, having this map be a zone capture is more of a problem than anything else. Even leaving aside the unfortunate Icebrood Saga associations, in terms of game progression, we've just had Dragon's End, which is a map that centers entirely around its meta event. Now, directly after that, we've got another one. I just want to be able to explore the Jade Sea at my leisure, and now we have 2 maps where I can't. Really, I think the best fit to satisfy the story and mechanical constraints would have been something more along the lines of Auric Basin, pre-events focused on building up ahead of a push, only instead of it being, a 4-sided defense, it's more focused on preparing for that last section in the deep. You could have events where you deliver recharges for the air filters or help miners who are in danger of running out of charges and being exposed to the haze. Then, the culmination is some sort of electrical blackout which has similarly mysterious and spooky origins to the ongoing radio static, and as a result some of the miners are exposed to the haze and turn on everyone, needing to be brought under control as a result. You could even have those siege events around the mining outposts, but as a result of that blackout instead of being territory control. Maybe a sort of a last hurrah before the final siege. And then instead of fighting our way down the mines, we've got that steady access sorted out, and we just need to make sure the supply lines stay open. And a failure state still means you have a long run back while the forward outposts are recaptured, but overall more of a silver waste feel than drizzlewood. But most importantly, by having the map open more of the time like this and allowing the central NPCs to engage in events which repeat more reliably, those map events can be added to part of the story journal, helping to bump it out further and bridge the gap between the surface and the deeps. They could even have done a repeat of Biora's instancing and have it be, the NPCs on the first run when you're doing the story, and then, it just doubles back to being regular Brotherhood miners afterwards. I really do think this is all it would have needed to make the story feel about the same length as any other patch. We didn't need a lot more, and, most of the content is technically already there. It's just easy to forget how much the story in past patches has us do the map meta, because that's not how End of Dragons and Season 1 worked. I think another important difference would have been to take the time in the story to show at least some of those miners recovering from their delusion when they're brought outside, because it actually wasn't entirely clear if they could, which then has the unfortunate side effect of making the commander seem to have yet more plot armor. If there were an event where you had to rescue miners and bring them up for air, maybe even, fight them down to 5% health and knock some sense into them afterwards, I think that would make the final moments more believable. And actually, on that note, I think they really missed a trick with the finale. Why didn't Rama and co beat the crap out of the commander, instead of a casual bit of lightheadedness taking them out? It would really have fitted with the whole angle of the commander being a little, unreliable. And that's also a reason to bring the 3 of them back together after they were squabbling the entire patch. Not to mention, it's a real departure from all the other times we've passed out in the story and then been rescued. I actually wouldn't have found this for myself, but someone pointed me in the direction of the story journal, and if you read it, it's very clear there's a deliberate emphasis on the commander's emotional stability being, not that stable. I think our friends having to overpower us for our own good would really have raised the stakes on that final story beat of knowing that we're going to have to go back down there and do it all again in the name of the greater good. Which neatly brings us to the end of the patch, and here I think it's a technical oversight which has caused the biggest problem. It's not obvious at first that what's happened is the seamless transition into the next chapter instead of a sort of Champions-esque pause halfway through the chapter itself. That's bad optics. The only time before that the story has left off on a watch this space in the top right was during those patches, and I mean, I got a bad taste in my mouth. I understand the idea, but especially as we don't yet know the release cadence, leaving off in this way doesn't leave me eager to log in when the next update drops. It just feels as though the patch was cut in half and the rest is being held back. Letting the chapter end stand as it actually is would have avoided that. And I feel as though this side of things has always been ArenaNet's shortcoming. They can deliver amazing story or hugely satisfying combat encounters and then trip over on the presentation in such a way that people only focus on the one thing that was missing. And in this case, when the story patch is going to be showcasing a new form of direction and how the future will play out, it was all the more important to get those optics right. Which really frustrates me because, and feel free to call it copium, I don't feel pessimistic about the future at this point. One lackluster patch does not a death knell make. Part of me wonders if, after Grothmar promised far more than the Icebrood saga ultimately could give, they deliberately didn't want to blow their budgets on this patch and run out of steam further down the line. But if so, and that's obviously a huge if, this is sort of the opposite problem. After a year spent restoring Season 1, which a number of veteran players skipped over because it was old content, we really did want something substantial. So from that perspective, I don't think it's being unreasonable or being a doomer to feel that this patch just wasn't it. It was close, and it didn't need to be wholly different or twice as long or anything like that, but it still feels like a miss to me, and all the more frustrating for just how close it came to sticking the landing. Anyway, this has been my ramble. I've never made a video like this before. I have no idea if anyone's going to be interested in my thoughts or anything like that, but it frustrates me when I think, man, just a couple of little things, just a couple of little things differently, and it could have had the same overall shape, but maybe felt better. I don't know.